Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I am Shantae Stocks. I am the Assistant Director of Engaged Scholarship for the Center for Social Concern. And tonight we're going to have the awesome and the wonderful Dr. Moffitt join us to be speaking on Black Americans' race and representation in the media, and to give you a little feedback or a little information about who Dr. Moffitt is. I'm going to share with you a brief biography. Dr. Kimberly R. Moffitt is the Interim Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at UMBC. Dr. Moffitt's research focuses on mediated representation of marginalized groups, as well as the politicized nature of Black hair and the body. She has published 3 co-edited volumes. She extends her research interests into the community by offering workshops on Black hair and body politics as it relates to bullying among middle school girls. Dr. Moffitt often writes op-ed articles for the Baltimore Sun and is a frequent guest on local public radio programs. She is a founding parent and board member of the Baltimore Collegiate School for Boys Charter School, our 4th through 12th college preparatory school in Baltimore City. And without further ado, I welcome Dr. Moffitt.
Thank you, Shantae.
And I'm sorry, Dr. Moffitt, yes. You can also ask questions in the chat. Apologies for interrupting.
That's quite all right. I just wanted to make sure I made the correction that I'm certainly founding parent and Baltimore Collegiate is dear to my heart, but I am no longer serving on its board and would not want to offend anyone who is currently there and doing all of the good work for those boys in Baltimore Collegiate School for Boys School. So thank you so much for joining me. I have been in meetings talking all day long, so I can already tell that my voice is starting to get a little raspy. So my apologies for that, but I'm still looking forward to an opportunity to share just a broad overview of some information that I have for you on race and representation. And then hopefully we can engage in a discussion in the Q&A session. So I start by showing you 3 images that I think are really important for you. One is Kamala Harris telling her great niece that she too can become vice president or even president. And then we have Barack Obama confirming for this 5-year-old boy that his hair is just like his, which assures him that someone that looks like him can also be president. And then the 3rd image is actress Anika Noni Rose, who causes a room full of people to hold their breath as they share this very tender moment with a 4-year-old girl wanting to have a private chat with Princess Tiana. If you don't get chills from those images, you must be dead. Because what all 3 of these photos show us is what John F. Kennedy said so eloquently, children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see. I expand upon his quote, although eloquent, by adding, this is why we must give children vast representations so they come to understand their vast possibilities. So before I start and sharing a slew of images with you and giving some context about this whole notion of representation, I've got 3 concepts that I'd like to share with you that will come up time and time again, and then hopefully we will also engage them during the Q&A. So in terms of representation, I keep using this word representation. Well, what does it mean? And oftentimes the purpose of using that term is to make specific reference to the portrayal of a person that is presented in a particular way, often showing that they represent or embody a certain nature. Representations are found in literature and in all forms of media. And they also help to craft the pictures in our mind. Social construction of reality, which I use to base much of the research that I do on mediated representations, is a theoretical concept by Berger and Luckman that says that we, through communication, in particular through communication with our social groups, that we create our worlds, that this is not always founded in book or academic knowledge, but more so through the powerful and informal exchanges that we have with our social groups. Journalist Walter Lippmann adds to this. I love this quote. He says, "For the most part, we do not first see and then define. We define first and then see." What does that mean? So what he's telling us is that many of our social groups, whether it's race, ethnicity, whether it's a Greek lettered organization, a religious organization, our political philosophies or affiliations, our sexual orientation, certainly gender, and even our socioeconomic status, that we use all of those to craft a world or an understanding of a world that makes sense to us. And so even though we may not have the images yet, we craft that world. And then when we see media, we reinforce the world that we have created. I use contemporary example for you. How is it possible, and this is not a political discussion, it's just to show what I'm talking about in terms of creating worlds. How is it possible that you have a political group, conservatives, that believe masks serve no purpose in against COVID, but yet liberals do? That's not a political argument. It's simply to say, in terms of social construction of reality, what we often do is based on those exchanges with the social groups that are important to us, those are then the worlds that we create. And so we've got political groups that then ascribe to particular ways of being or ways of understanding themselves solely based on the interactions that exist between them, barring any other information, because that's not what's important to many of us as human beings. Hegemonic media. This is the use of media to maintain and reiterate the status quo of a given society. I specifically mentioned given society because the media looks different and conveys different messages depending on the society that you're in. What we are conveying here in the States looks different than what's being conveyed in Ghana, West Africa. What we are conveying here in the state of Maryland looks different than straight down I-95 in Virginia. And that shows us that, again, there is this notion that the media helps to tell us a story, to give us a sense of what is the right way to be an American or to be a good human being in society. There's a reason why so much of society believes that being married is better than being single. There's a reason that we have created a society that says male status reigns or heterosexuality reigns as a status that's deemed normal, right? But not, clearly, I'm not arguing that point, but it gives the perception through media that those are the right ways or the normal ways in which for us to carry out, when in fact, it is simply the media's goal to give us a sense that that's how we all should believe the world should be, instead of giving us the flexibility and certainly the room and expansive nature of being humans to be able to think for ourselves and see the world differently. So very quickly about media though. Now, I am a media studies scholar, so I'm not going to sit here and say all things are bad about media, nor will I say all things are good, because I am a realist when it comes to talking about the work that I do. So I recognize that there's a role for media and it as an industry, but there's also a role for us as partakers in media, as consumers of media. What are we doing with it? What I will first say to you is clearly, just like any other industry in our country, media are businesses. And because they are businesses, they have the goal of doing what? Making money, of course. And so clearly that sometimes dictates what the media convey to us, even more so than the actual information that we as informed consumers are desirous of. So we may not get everything that we want, even though the media is set and established to inform us. But the media also recognizes that if it's not successful financially, then it serves very little purpose. So it's important to hold on to that, certainly as we as consumers are engaging media, which is what we should be doing, is engaging it. In terms of this whole notion of media bias, I would say absolutely, it's real, partly because we have a status quo that we're always trying to maintain, that we have a particular view of the world that we want to embrace and say, this is the right way in which we should be living. But I would also add to that, that there's no such thing as fake news. Now, again, that's not a political stance because I'm not going there. What I'm simply saying is all news is news. Some news is accurate, some news is inaccurate, but it doesn't make it fake. It just makes it inaccurate. And I think there's a huge distinction that needs to be made there, because at the end of the day, it's still news, it's still information that you can take hold of and decide to do something with, whether it is to tweet or post on Facebook or IG, or even send out a message to friends to say, this is what I learned via the news. The problem with that, it is lazy. It relies on one industry to give us all our information that then we decide to just take and run with it without ever interrogating or questioning it in a deeper way to make sure that we are not making mistakes, that we are in fact receiving the right information that benefits us, that educates us further, and does not buy into conspiracies. But again, we're a little lazy about it. We love the idea, especially now that we are surrounded by social media, that we have the opportunity for any platform to give us what we need without us having to do the investigation or the work to find out what the truth is. Media literacy is asking you to be more engaged. And I'll come back to that point in my closing remarks. So as a result of this laziness, what we have a tendency to do is rely upon old, recycled, perpetuated tropes. And I've defined tropes here for you as a universally identified image imbued with several layers of contextual meaning that creates a new visual metaphor for you. And so after, what you find is, after time, there are certain images that consistently are given to us that we are then able to pinpoint them when they show up in different media forms. And that becomes a trope because we've first accepted it and decided not to question it. We've also decided not to think about it in any deeper way. We simply see it being given to us via media, so it must be fact. It must be accurate without ever challenging it, which is what we should be doing. And in fact, we should be acting upon it as fact, but we should not be acting upon the tropes as fact, but we as critically engaged media consumers should be acting upon to make sure we understand what is fact and then what is fiction. What I've shared with you are just a couple of examples of scholars over the years who have also talked about a number of these particular tropes, or they may refer to them as representations and even images. One of the most well-known, of course, is the one in the center by Donald Bogle, entitled Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks. The first edition of his book came out in 1973. The most recent edition came out in 2019. So he has done tremendous work to create this history for us to understand what these tropes look like and how they have evolved over time in media and what we see them impacting or how they impact society today, which is a bit of what I'm going to talk about. So how am I going to talk about it? So I've got several images that I want to share with you. I decided not to use video because it's always hit or miss with our new platforms that we're all consumed by on a daily basis. So I thought I would just give stills, but give references to you so that you can learn a little bit of this history about Black men and Black women that show up in media in various forms, and then give you a sense of how that looks today. So some of the early images that I have shared with you oftentimes portrayed Black men involved in criminal activity. They were also seen as sexual deviants, especially with a desire to harm white women. That example can be seen in this first image, which is the character Gus in the D.W. Griffith film, A Birth of a Nation in 1915. Then we can also think about the happy slave or servant that gets perpetuated of Black men. And this is, of course, Disney's Song of the South in 1946. Also a role that Black men tended to play in early film and early media are that of entertainers. And that could be entertaining in terms of their physical prowess, or it could be entertaining in terms of their comedic roles, or certainly in terms of their talents. So the image that I'm showing you above is the Nicholas brothers from the film Stormy Weather, which is 1943. And then on the side is just simply an image still of Jack Johnson, who is a renowned Black boxer. And the particular image I've shown is one that gets used often to characterize him because of the difference in size, the physical presence of Jack Johnson over his competitors to be able to solidify a particular idea of the physical prowess that existed with Black men. Early images of Black women in media. What we often saw in these were women who were utilizing their sexual prowess quite a bit to wreak havoc on lives. So you see in the first image, this is Nina Mae McKinney in a film called Hallelujah, 1929. But we also see that same idea or image being used about Black women when we think about Dorothy Dandridge in her renowned role in Carmen Jones, which was 1954. In addition to the use of the sexual, the nature, we also have the angry or sassy, of course, Black woman, like the 1939 film with Hattie McDaniels, Gone with the Wind. And then very headstrong and stubborn as hell Black women characters like Beneatha in the first iteration of A Raisin in the Sun on film. It was done on Broadway in 1959. It aired on as a movie in 1961. So Black men in contemporary media. Some of the images that I'm showing pretty much start in the 70s up to the present. And I've chosen some of these just for you to get a sense of what is the connection between some of those historical tropes or representations of Black men and where we are currently. So what we do know is Black men are still entertaining, and that is either in comedic roles like Coming to America, done in 1988, or in professional sports like NBA great LeBron James, which is of course present. We also see very few dramatic roles in which Black men are playing. They are less frequent, and when they are, oftentimes we see them riddled with recycled stereotypes. So I love talking about this one. This image still is Melvin Van Peebles. He was director and the main character in the 1971 film Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. And what's interesting about this character is of course, I said 1971, so we are in the phase of Black power, Black is beautiful, a moment in which we are seeing the world differently and wanting to embrace this notion of what Blackness means in society. And so Melvin Van Peebles decided to tell a story in which he was this strong Black man. Here's what's interesting about it. He ends up utilizing his sexual prowess to escape any mischief or harm throughout the entire film. That includes even a scene in which he has been picked up by white supremacists who essentially are members of the KKK, and they are planning to bring harm to him. But as long as he can sexually satisfy one of the women leaders of the group, he too can be freed, which he is. So that gives you a sense of that physical prowess from the early images that we talked about, with images like Jack Johnson, bringing us to later 20th century, where you see the sexual prowess is being used and conjured up as an image for Black men. We also see in Get Out, how Get Out, which is a more contemporary film, uses a twisted thriller, but also physical violence. He uses his body in order to escape harm. Again, that whole idea of the physical prowess being fairly consistent with how we look at and represent Black men in films. And I would say that, of course, Django is more comedic role, even though it's trying to tell a story, but this character easily is there for our sense of humor and understanding this, this pushback against that old recycled, happy slave servant that we saw in Uncle Remus when we talked about Song in the South on our earlier slide. What I would say to you is that Black Panther is seen as an anomaly, and much of the literature and writing that has been done about this particular film shows it as an anomaly for a role that is solely, although we see comedic expressions happening in the film, but it is a dramatic role. And it is a very serious dramatic role for a Black male that not only uses a story to tell us what his life is as a strong Black figure, but it also utilizes the fictional place to recreate and craft a new world. So the whole notion of Afrofuturism is seen coming to life in this Marvel comic of Black Panther, which then gets taken to the big screen. And I'll mention that again a little later. Okay, contemporary images of Black women and what we see. Again, we've got some instances that in the 70s, I'll use the example of Kofi, which was done in 1973. We even see, again, that consistent line of Black women being sexual objects or utilizing their sexual prowess to accomplish what it is that they'd like to gain. We also see, which is typical in especially films that have a focal point on women in general, not just Black women, but women in general, is this notion of being shown as catty, or the amount of work, like how difficult it is to be able to cultivate sisterhood. We see that, of course, in Spike Lee's School Days in 1988, and then again in Waiting to Exhale in 1995. The notion again of the sassy, headstrong, no nonsense persona shows up again. And if you notice, we utilize that same language about Black women in their early images. And we see that consistently being used even here. That again, very sassy, headstrong, no nonsense, very straight to the point, no straight, no chaser. We see that again with Kofi. We also see that in Queen and Slim, which is a very contemporary film of 2019. And then I would also suggest that even Serena Williams, as a real life character, a well-known, probably the most celebrated of women tennis players, and how strong she is, and how those attributes of her being strong-willed show up quite a bit, not just playing the sport, but when she's engaging during the sport. And then we can't forget, I would say in the research that I've done over the years, about at least each decade, there is always a film that's trying to take us back to reminisce parts of the past that we love as Americans, that many of us love, not all of us, but it takes us back to a place where things seem so much more simple, and that life was not as convoluted and so complex as what we're dealing with now. And oftentimes that specific point in time is during the 1950s. We hear this same talk during political debates or political ideologies in terms of where candidates may stand, that becomes a spot or a place to make reference to when things were done and done well in America. The problem with that is it captures Black women in particular in media as playing more subservient roles. So what about these? So what I've written about in terms of representations is it's an interesting spot to be in where Black representations oftentimes are being revered and reviled simultaneously. What do I mean by that? That at the same time, a particular image or a particular person is being held up and acknowledged for their talents and their contributions to society, while at the same time being reviled for expressions of self, possibly their politics, or aspects of who they are, what they look like, right? Their hair texture, their skin hue, what their body looks like. And that exists in one person. So you're talking about a body that has to negotiate this constantly, recognizing that people are putting upon that body these representations, or what I also write about is called scripting, where we put these scripts on the body and expect it to perform the way that we want to, but when it doesn't, we revile it. When it does, we revere it. So let's think about someone like a LeBron James, who is certainly revered for his ability on the basketball court, but he is at the same time reviled because sometimes he doesn't just dribble the basketball. Sometimes he actually gives a thought. And sometimes that thought goes against what status quo and what the general society may say is inappropriate for him as a entertainer, basketball player should be providing us. And so he ends up experiencing this moment of having to navigate both of those one at the same time. So how does this show up in our society? So there are a few things. First of all, it causes tremendous cognitive dissonance for us because, again, that idea that we put something upon a body that we expect it to do, and then we're looking for it to be reinforced for us in society so that we then can confirm what it is that we already have socially constructed our world to be. So I give 3 examples here very quickly. One being the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, again, not political stance. There are a number of ways that this particular idea can be talked about. And so I show the one image where you see a slew of engaged citizens who are marching and talking about the need to address issues of injustice that seem to disproportionately happen to one particular racial group in this country over others. But what many of us through media, in terms of what we've already constructed in our head and what we then decide we need for confirmation, what we then do is look at images such as this, which is actually local. It's from the Freddie Gray uprising, where we see that this is the image that confirms for us Black Lives Matter. And because of that, it then confirms for us why we can't support engaged citizens trying to write a society to address some of the concerns that are happening in it, right? The same thing, and this is an older example, but Michelle Obama, former First Lady Michelle Obama. This is her official White House photo when she was still in the White House. However, because of our connection, again, to the idea of that Black, angry woman who's sassy, headstrong, straight no chaser, we couldn't keep her in this particular image. She couldn't stay there. She had to look more like what we put her as on the New Yorker, right? the fist bump that some of us refer to as a terrorist bump. And we've got her dressed like a guerrilla fighter, right? That she's ready to go to war in the White House, representing our country, supposed to be helping her husband guide and lead us to a place where many of us are successful and happy and living prosperously the way that we have been told that we have access to for the American dream. But that's not given to her because it doesn't fit what many of us have already socially constructed to be the reality of what Black women do, think, and look like in our society. The third image that I have is one of a Black family. And this isn't, it's just a random image, because what I wanted to do was to give the idea or to talk about Black families and how this is not seen as an idea that exists in our society. That instead, we believe that the only idea of Black families that exists in our society, again, utilizing an image that's local from the Freddie Gray uprising, the Baltimore uprising, where we've got a single mom who, again, representing some of that anger, aggression, frustration, no nonsense, who is reprimanding her child who happened to be participating in one of the protests during the uprising. So it gives a sense of, again, some of these images reinforce for some and make it difficult for others to push back against, because it's creating the cognitive dissonance where they believe that if I'm seeing this in media, then it too must be accurate. And based on, again, that socially constructed world that I have created, those folks who are a part of my church, those individuals who are part of the same political party or the same racial or ethnic group, the same class, the same geographic location, who I engage regularly and value their opinion, it helps to confirm what I'm seeing on media. So then it becomes very difficult to turn around and expect someone to refute it or to push back on it unless we choose to be more engaged in media. And that's where I'm going to wrap up and say to you, what's next? So I use the expression, of course, art clearly imitates life, but there is an opportunity for us to be visionary here. And the way in which we see that visionary coming to pass is that in the generation that we're currently in terms of the genre of various forms of media, we are being given so many other outlets and avenues in which to understand what's happening in media. What do I mean by that? We have tremendous access, which means more and more voices and individuals have access to producing media for us. And as a result of that, it also gives us the opportunity to hear, to learn, and to see new stories. For instance, like, of course, Moonlight that came out in 2016, or the animated series Shuri, which was on Black Panther's younger sister. And then, of course, See You Yesterday, which was on Netflix, and Lovecraft Country, which is on HBO, both giving us an opportunity to see Blackness in the future being articulated to us in innovative ways. That Blackness does exist in the future, that Blackness doesn't have to be defined just by the history of slavery. It doesn't have to be defined just by Jim Crow, and certainly not just by the civil rights movement, but that it is much more expansive than that, and that there is so much more to understand about what Blackness means. And these are just a few examples of how you can see that show up in society. But I take you back where I started, where I talked about the fact that there, in terms of the role of media, that there's their role as an industry, but there's also our role, your role as an engaged citizen and consumer. So what is your role? First, I'm going to say media literacy, which means you've got to do the work. I serve on the board of the National Association for Media Literacy Education, which is geared towards trying to teach K-12 and certainly even college students how to effectively engage media so that you can enjoy it, although my family would say I've spoiled media for them altogether. But the goal of media literacy is, in fact, to give you the opportunity to still enjoy media, but at the same time, be able to critique it, be able to engage it, be able to challenge it, and know that some of the images that you are digesting or engaging are not factual, that they are just snippets of what someone has crafted and provided you as a truth with a little t, right? Has given you as a truth that then they anticipate for you to continue to view your world from that perspective. So media literacy gives us the opportunity to stretch ourselves a bit beyond what is familiar. This is the same thing that I try and teach my students. This is the same thing that I try and teach my teenagers. My 14 and 16-year-old who are so engrossed in anything social media that I'm trying to teach them that even if you choose to engage it, make sure you understand it and understand what the messages are so it doesn't shift or change what you know about self, because that's the biggest point. That takes me very quickly to the point about celebrating and critiquing, that not only do we know that we're experiencing this notion of one body being revered and reviled, at the same time, we should be creating spaces where Blackness and its representations in media are being celebrated, but also critiqued, because it's not all good. There's plenty of the examples that I've shared with you tonight that are quite problematic, but I use them to be able to show you an evolution of what some of these images look like over time. But we should be in 21st century in a spot in which we can watch media and celebrate like we did with Black Panther, but also be able to critique. And there were critiques of Black Panther. As much as that film seemed to be an anomaly that stood out among many about representing Blackness in a very positive way, there were still critiques. And that's okay, because there's no such thing as a perfect film. There's no such thing as a perfect form of media. And so we want to be able to critique, but we must also be able to celebrate. And the ways in which of doing this, and this is, I will say to you as an aside, the direction that I have now gone with my media work is really focusing on primarily teenagers. My most recent project that I'm doing is I have done focus groups with middle school boys and girls and high school boys and girls. And we're having conversations around the whole notion of colorism. This whole idea that there is this privileged social hierarchy within a number of communities of color, but I'm speaking specifically about the African-American community, where light skin has tremendous privilege in ways that darker complexions do not. And what I have learned is when I'm teaching such topics in my college classrooms, I feel like I need to have a therapist sitting next to me, because I'm experiencing a number of young people who are dealing with forms of trauma or scarring that they have dealt with as young people around issues of colorism. So I then decided I'm waiting too late, or actually I will be honest with you, it was my 14-year-old daughter who said, "You're waiting too late. You need to have these conversations with us middle schoolers and tell us what we should be thinking about colorism, teaching us how to push back on it, teaching us not to call one another names based on the skin hue that we reside in." And based on that, I'm really interested in the healing process, or making sure that we don't have to do so much healing in the adult years by talking to young people now. And so that's a part of this whole piece that I'm saying, where we need to explore text for self-healing and questioning, because we as adults have already dealt with so many issues. Now it's time to make sure we're thinking about young people and protecting them. We can do our texts and read about how to heal thyself, but we also need to be able to give a power to the language and words and actions that we're using with young people so that we can avoid that same trajectory for them. And then I end with the idea of taking some social justice action. Boy, talk about a summer, right, in which we have encountered a number of different civil and social unrest related to issues of police brutality, certainly white supremacy, structural racism, all topics that we are also grappling with in our colleges, college classrooms, and as institutions as a whole. And what I would say to you is that this is not the way for everyone. We all have a role to play, and not everyone has to take action, the physical action that many young people chose to this summer. But if that is your way to have your voice heard, I encourage it, because that is the beauty of being an American, is to make sure your voice is heard. It is the quintessential nature of what it means to be American, is to have your voice heard and to be able to protest. But if that is not your way, find your way so that you too can resist many of the images that I've talked about tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moffitt. Now we're going to have some time for Q&A. We really appreciate the very stimulating conversation and presentation. The first question that we have.
Oh, good.
It's interesting that you brought up the point about the movies being reminiscent of a time period that captures Black women in subservience. But I always thought that it was a way to make sure America and American media doesn't forget its choices and heinous history. Can you extrapolate on your view here?
I don't know if there's much more I can offer. I do think there is an aspect of such films that are to remind America of how it behaved or acted in the past, in hopes of it not repeating its mistakes. But there are also many examples of such films, including the one that I shared here with The Help, that is really about endearing us to a particular time period that reflects a time that, again, we felt was so much more simpler, that we didn't have these difficult conversations that were necessary. It seemed that everyone understood and knew their place. And because of that, life went along simply. And so what I say in response to that is, while it reminds us of that history and says how problematic it is, at the same time, it is perpetuating the idea of this period of time that many people miss. And that's the part that I think becomes problematic. If we didn't continue to do such films, I would say, and who knows, because we're talking about many from those generations now no longer with us. So we may not see those films continue, but certainly the fact that we see them reoccur in some way to remind us of that time period does do something to almost endear us to that time period, to reconnect certain audience members with the time that they really do miss and reminisce about.
Thank you. Another question. It seems as if some individuals' celebration of representation in media are tied to rejection of any and all critique of an artistic piece. How can we improve conversations regarding celebration and critique?
I wish the questioner would give an example, because I want to make sure that I'm answering this the way that they'd like. I do, for me, and I do this in all of my research, so I should say this whole notion of celebrate and critique is a part of what I try to do. That as much as there is to complain about or critique about different representations that I personally disagree with, I feel like it's important to make sure we do something with that we don't just critique for critique's sake, that we actually do something with it, that if we feel like there's a problem with it, what then do we do to make it better? And so for me, in my research, it's the same thing. One of my more recent pieces is Dr. Stocks didn't share this part, but I do a lot of criticism on Disney programming, and I'm never, well liked for doing so, but it is one of the areas that I'm very interested in terms of, again, those early images that are used to help create how children understand who they are and their place in the world. I want to look to those particular media creators and what messages are they sending or creating about, in particular, children of color. And in one of my more recent pieces, it was focusing on Princess Tiana from the movie The Princess and the Frog. And as much as I critiqued that film, I also found ways to celebrate why it was important that she was the first Black princess with Disney. Because even though she doesn't get that recognition, what I do in my work about Princess Tiana is show that she literally is the shift that Disney needed to create the other princesses that come after her. If you think about who came before Princess Tiana, up to that point, they all carried out particular roles. They all fit a particular idea of what a princess looked like in society, in animated world. But it took Princess Tiana to be this major shift to say, we're done with that. Because 21st century Disney princesses looks like her. Very independent, self-assured, able to take care of herself, has aspirations of her own. She wants to create her own business, and she'll consider deciding to settle down and marry her mate. So that became a major transition for Disney to then create Rapunzel, Merida and Brave, Moana, and the list goes on and on. So Princess Tiana or Disney could not have had the 21st century princesses without someone like Princess Tiana. So in that very space, I'm critiquing, but I'm also celebrating what I see happening in the media. And it's the same thing that I think that we have to learn to do, which we can only do once we are willing to be really engaged media consumers, instead of sitting idly and passively and taking in what comes to us and saying, oh, this sucks, or I don't like this, that we then are able to see other aspects of the work and talk about ways in which it can be celebrated.
Thank you.
Sorry, I know that was long-winded.
Would you say that the movies such as The Help are more about reminiscing or about perpetrating the white savior trope? Or would you say that these themes often overlap?
Yes, they overlap. I mean, it's real easy to answer that one. Yes, I think they overlap. I don't think it's one and the same, because I think you have to look at so much of who is behind the creation of it, right? You've got to think about the women in that, as in that example. You have to think about the women who chose to play in that movie. You have to think about the creator. You have to think about the author of the book that then became the movie. There's so many players at the table that it can't just be one item and that's it, because there are too many people who are at the table to create what it is that we saw in 2011 in The Help. And so I see it very much as, yes, white savior complex comes up, but it also very much is, again, reminiscent of a particular time and place that life seems so much simpler. And for those of us who don't have access to that time and place, it seems distant for us. We can't understand it. We don't have a sense of what it looked like other than what we're reading and possibly what we're learning from our elders. But what I'm suggesting is, for those who were living in its time, for those of you who have seen, for instance, Back to the Future, when it goes back to 1950s, there are particular aspects of movies that highlight the 50s that really capture for us how simple life was. And now, compared to 1950, compared to 2020, this mess is complex and it overwhelms many of us, just how complex it is. And wouldn't it be nice to just know that this is how everyone is to carry out being an American?
Thank you. Another question. What role has Netflix played in confirming or challenging existing tropes? What does the rise of Ava DuVernay and Lena Waithe mean in the context of your work?
Yep. It means exactly what I'm talking about, that it gives us the opportunity to push back on old tropes, but it also gives us the opportunity to see new ways of being in terms of Blackness. So that's why I use the example of See You Yesterday, which was a Spike Lee, he was executive producer for, which was on Netflix, or even Lovecraft Country, which is all about, well, both of them are dealing with kind of Afrofuturism. And it gives us the opportunity to see Blackness in a much more expansive way. Now, mind you, we're still talking about people who grew up with their own notions of what Blackness is and how people should behave or what it should look like. So of course, we're still going to see some of the perpetuated tropes and representations that exist about Blackness that we saw in many of the examples that I talked about throughout my talk. But where we are now, again, a venue or a platform like Netflix, which gives tremendous access to so many more people. So this isn't about green lighting just to be on ABC. Now you've got a venue like Netflix. Now you've got YouTube. Now you even have Twitter to be able to provide short clips and films. That gives access to the masses. And is it all good? Absolutely not. It's not all good, because not everyone is utilizing those media in the way that we feel like it should be utilized to entertain or to inform us. But it's provided such access that we get to hear so many stories. And it's just up to us as engaged consumers to weed out what doesn't work for us, right? Or what seems problematic, or what really isn't news. But the idea that we've got such a diversity of voices being able to comment on what Blackness looks like and how it shows up in media, I think is a good thing. And I say that recognizing that there's a lot of TV that I do not watch because I consider it a bit too ratchet for me and not appropriate for the way in which I'm trying to construct or view my form of Blackness. But I also recognize that Blackness is just that expansive, that there is multiple stories to tell, multiple narratives that need to be heard, and these platforms are giving us that, and that's a good thing.
Thank you. Another question. How can the media work to fight against the all too common view of professional athletes as solely athletes and counteract the statement for athletes to just shut up and play?
Yep, yep. This one has been, I don't have a quick and dirty answer for it, because this has been going on for a while. In fact, my dissertation research looked at the representations of Black male athletes. And so since the whole, I mean, even before there was a notion of professional sports that Black men could participate in, when Black male slaves would participate in boxing fights and matches on slave plantations for entertainment for their slave owners and friends, we have held on to the notion that it's all brawn and no brain. And so there's the physical presence and prowess of Black men that will also seemingly construe to being sexual prowess, but there is nothing above that point that seems to have value, that we see them solely as these beings that are to perform for us and do magnificently on that court or on that field for us, but not having the ability to articulate particular thoughts and ideas that raise questions about injustice or give us a sense of how literally how intelligent they may be. Because the notion is, I mean, the whole dumb jock stereotype, right, exists for all athletes, but it really is a part of the makeup of how and trope of how we look at Black men, that we don't believe there's any other value to what they are contributing except their performance in their particular sport. And so what it does is it really negates the opportunity for those who have a degree of power, a degree of following, where people will listen to them. It negates that opportunity for them to be heard, because individuals immediately believe that they have nothing of intellectual value to contribute.
Thank you. And that concludes the questions. Thank you so much for such an engaging presentation. And I thank the audience for your engaging questions as well. Thank you all for coming out tonight. And I hope that you all have a great evening and you're getting lots of thanks in the chat, Dr. Moffitt.
Good. And please, Dr. Stocks, make sure that folks know, since I'm local and just across town from physically from Hopkins, that they should be able to reach out to me should they want to continue any parts of this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone. And thank you for coming to the talk.
Take care.